One. Good evening, Canby, and welcome to our regularly scheduled Planning Commission meeting.
Matt, just give us 1 sec here.
We're not on yet?
It says, do you want to stop recording?
We're on.
Okay, welcome to the Canby Planning Commission. Please join us in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you very much. Consent items for tonight, we have one, and that is the draft meeting minutes for June 24th, 2024. We will take a motion to adopt those meeting minutes.
I move to adopt the meeting minutes of June 24, 2024 as written.
And a second.
I second.
Very well. We'll start with a roll call vote, starting with Commissioner Driscoll.
Aye.
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 Have to abstain, I was absent.
Very well. So the ayes have it, 4-2, well, 1 abstain and 1 absent. So meeting minutes will be adopted for June 24th, 2024. Next is citizen input on non-agenda items. This is an opportunity for members of the public to address the Planning Commission on non-agenda items. Each person will be given 3 minutes to speak. Staff and Planning Commission will make every effort to respond to questions raised during citizen input before the meeting ends, or as quickly as possible thereafter. Lainey, do we have any
No, we don't.
any comments? Okay, fantastic. We have no old business, no new business, and we are not scheduled to hear any public hearings. Therefore, we will move to the Planning Commission work session. And the purpose of tonight's work session is to give the Planning Commission the opportunity to continue our fence code discussion with a focus on fences in special conditions. To make the most of the short time we are given for these work sessions, public comment will not be taken. Instead, we invite public comment at all of the Planning Commission's regular meetings under either of the 2 opportunities dedicated on each agenda for public comment. In addition, we invite the public to contact city staff with comments or concerns. Although this is a public meeting, the Planning Commission cannot make any formal decision in a work session. Next step actions are often determined for deliberation and discussion at a properly noticed Planning Commission hearing. And with that, we will turn our discussion for fence code discussion number 5 over to Mr. Potter to present.
Good evening, Chair Ellison and members of the Planning Commission. This presentation is very imagery based, so hopefully you all have your screens turned on. So just an outline of the presentation. I'm going to very briefly recap what we've talked about before. Then we're going to talk about fences along trails and paths, fences next to parks and streets, and then any other conditions that we want to talk about, and then go over next steps. So we've had 4 sessions already. I'm anticipating this is our last one before we come to you with code language. But the first one is where we talked about, like, why do we need to talk about this? What does our code say now? What are the code enforcement issues that we're having? You know, why do you want to have taller fences? Why do you want to have shorter fences? We went through a lot of the philosophical aspects of it. For the second one, we had a lot of discussion. The third one, I came to you with some 3-dimensional models. Those are mostly focused on kind of standard house configurations. And then the fourth one, we really dug into the code language for houses on corner lots and residential lots, because those are the ones that are the most controversial, where people are wanting some more leniency in having taller fences on corner street-facing lots. So last time we talked about, planning staff had met and kind of, because it determined that because this issue is so nebulous, that we would kind of separate the whole conversation into 3 buckets. So the first one was, like I was just talking about, fences for typical residential yards. The second one is what we're talking about tonight, which is fences for special conditions. And then the third bucket is a little less about the code language and more about some of these broader discussions about enforcement and permits and things like that. So bucket one was last session, and this session is the middle one. So our current code language is pretty thin on fences once you get outside the residential fence code, which applies to residential zones and then C1, which is the downtown area. They kind of share that code language. So outside of that, there's a few provisions about special conditions. So the first one I'm going to talk about, and this is the main one outside the ones that we've already talked about. And so this is what our code currently says, and this is for fences along a public pedestrian or bicycle pathway, and you're basically required to do 2 or 3 of the options at the bottom, depending on the situation. The code language now says basically if you have a new subdivision, you have to do A or B, but if you're in an individual lot somewhere else, then you can do A, B, or C. The first one is, and again, this is for being against the pedestrian or bicycle path. You either can do solid fencing, but no greater than 4 feet. You can do fencing that's open wire or wood slats, something that has some visual permeability. Or you can do, and this is only if you're one of those individual lots outside a new subdivision, you can do solid fencing, but it has to be set back 3 feet. So most of this presentation is I went around town and took a bunch of photos of existing situations. And so going back to that language, you can see for solid fences, you really have to, you're supposed to be no greater than 4 feet. In practice, it appears that's almost never happened or been enforced that way. And so you'll see that in some of these photos. This is an example of a recent subdivision that's got a really nice paved path between the logging road trail and a brand new subdivision. And you can see they have done full height fences for most of it. And then on the picture on the right, you can see that it steps down. And you're going to see this as a theme here is even though parts of the code haven't been followed, it seems like in practice, or maybe because the code used to be this way, a lot of these fences along paths follow what the residential lots have to do, which is full height for part of it, and then you step down. So this is in 7-acre estates, and you'll see these examples have a lot of different paths. And I should say, talking about fences along paths and bikeways is never going to fully resolve the what should a pathway look like. That's kind of somewhere else in the code. And so I think staff are aware that you could get into a whole other conversation is like, how wide should these paths be? Should you have landscaping on both sides? But we're kind of just trying to tackle the fence part of it right now. So this is an example that looks pretty good, but it actually looks quite good, but it doesn't necessarily follow that 4 feet minimum. Here's farther down the logging road trail, and you can see I've added insets for all these photos showing you where they are. So if you go south down the logging trail, all those residential subdivisions on the north side of town, most of them have a little pedestrian connection to the logging road trail or have multiple connections. And these are 2 examples that are both going east to the subdivisions to the east of the logging trail. And you can see there's some commonalities, mostly 6-foot fences. They have bollards, but the paths themselves, vary in width. But then even these 2 examples, they do step down. You can see at the very end there, they step down before they get to the street on the subdivision side. On the logging road side, they're just 6 feet Moving to the south side of town, there's actually quite a few pedestrian connections in some of these older neighborhoods as well. This is an example that of a path that goes through several blocks and connects the Ackerman Lee School complex with the subdivisions to the north. And so again, you can see the corrugated metal one, I think that's even over 6 feet, but you can see they did try to do the step down as they got closer to the residential street. So this is just another example of what these are looking like in practice over the years. This is back to the original set of pictures, but this is showing more what it looks like from the logging trail. So one of the goals, I think, is the codes should really be more specific about, neighborhood connection trails versus larger open space amenities. I would say this is a much different situation than on the right. You can see the part that actually goes between houses into the neighborhood versus the part that's actually on the broader open space corridor. And maybe Planning Commission is of the thought that it doesn't matter, they can be 6 feet on both conditions, but this is kind of showing both. Obviously, visually, it makes less difference how tall the fence is when you have a bunch of landscaping or trees as a buffer in front of it. And again, this is the main trend that I saw looking at all these existing older paths is they do step down. And so I think if the Planning Commission was wanting staff to write language to kind of memorialize what's already been happening like this, that we can certainly do that. And there's definitely a model, as you can see. And one could argue that this is trying to kind of balance the privacy versus not having a tunnel effect, because it sort of has a tunnel effect once you get in there, but it tries to soften it a little bit once you get to the front, towards the front yards.
One of the other major considerations, I think, is just whether it's a street.
Yep.
And whether there's traffic on it. And a lot of the times when we've discussed this in the past, it's about, whether you can see it, whether a car is coming back and forth, whether you go out into the street after your ball or whatever.
Right.
And then, balancing the back side of the property with people's individual privacy.
Right.
Is there any, one of the things that's nice about it is that the path is located in the center of a fairly broad green space. And so it having that buffer space, is that common for most of the trails other than the ones that are just access based?
You mean with the, here with the logging road trail?
Yeah,
up
the
north?
forest trail is huge. It's practically a long skinny park.
Right. In real life, it's mostly 6 foot of varying materials and varying placements, but it's mostly 6 feet right now. But I think I failed to mention, and you brought it up, the safety issues that go with this particular arrangement is when it is shorter in the front, it's also easier for when you're backing out. Like if you look at the top right photo where that truck is, if that truck was backing out and that was taller there, obviously it would be harder to see. Dawn, I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to echo what Michael said. I think the most important thing is having step downs and greater visibility wherever there might be a road or a sidewalk, anything that's going to involve pedestrians or bicyclists, and things that are farther down and away into kind of like an open green space. It seems reasonable to let people have a standard 6 foot fence because it's really not hurting anything or obscuring anything that could affect safety.
Sure. And I think that's consistent with what staff was thinking too. Okay, so moving a little away from paths and more towards something else we've talked about, which is fences that abut parks or public places that aren't paths or back up onto streets. And this is something where our code is really silent on most of it. So I think the goal for us would probably be to add a lot of code language that talks about what we want to see in those conditions. So right now, our code has this little piece that says, basically just talks about how no fence or wall shall be constructed in a subdivision where the point of the wall is to wall off that neighborhood from the rest of the community. And I think the principle behind that is great. It's a little vague to implement. Like, how do you judge whether something's fully blocking something off or not?
Especially since that's how we build subdivisions. you know.
Yeah.
They put an attractive, masonry fence all the way around it, and it's like, well, there's no gate, so you can't call it a gated community, but
But it is
There's-
effectively what they're saying not to do.
yeah.
Yeah.
Are we going to address gated communities that somebody might do one sometime?
I think the code could. yeah.
Okay.
So if this group has any advice for crafting that kind of language, we're definitely open to that. Or any other condition. So I also took some photos of some existing fences that abut parks or recreational areas. So this is an example on the north side of town at Northwoods Park. And this was an example of where the developer wanted to do something that was more enhanced and nice and more visually permeable. I know from experience, I think it looks great personally. I know we've also received complaints from some of these homeowners that there's not a lot of privacy. So if you see in the inset map, these photos are actually of a cul-de-sac. And so basically all the houses on the left side of that cul-de-sac, this is their backyard on that left photo. So they have patios and backyards that probably get some great sunlight and air circulation, but there's less privacy. But right now, our code doesn't really address this, so it's kind of dependent on the subdivision.
Well, kind of to the point of something we throw out there when there's multifamily projects before us where we say, oh, well, if they buy it, they agreed to it. Same deal. Like, they knew that was there. If they had a problem with it, they could do what the picture on the right did and put a line of arbor vitae or whatever around the edge.
Right.
So,
But the question
I'm not
is,
saying I
do-
have a problem with it per se,
Yeah.
but just to kind of point out that
Sure.
sometimes it might just be a matter of accepting what you chose to buy.
I guess the question is, do you want to mandate it? Not you personally, but does the planning commission, does the city want to mandate it in every instance in that condition, I guess?
Like the Forest Road is sort of a similar situation. But I have a little bit more intimate contact with Springwater Corridor up in Portland. I have a couple of locations that are directly adjacent to it. And it's very sensitive to patrol frequency. And if you go through the effort to keep things clear, then that's great. And I can see everything's great right now. I mean, trying to look at how the community goes out in the future and what can happen with budgets. I'm not sure how secure that Forest Road would be in the future, And it's like, you could kind of say the same thing here, is it's like, someone could be, they've got a pretty convenient access to the back of the house. There really is no back of the house when you're in this kind of situation. There's some other houses that abut territorial that are similar, but they're pinched between two streets. And so, the code's a little clearer there because it's like, a street and a street. But then again, along Ivy, some places, down close to where the middle school is, there's some places where there's tall fences right up against the road, so.
So what was some of the logic behind asking for shorter fencing around parks in the first place? Do we know?
I don't know about Canby, but this is exactly like our other house because it's on a golf course. And so everybody wants to see pretty green. So it could be that. And then at our other house, just, you can build up with iron. So if you don't, and it's not very expensive. Some of our neighbors have done that. So you can still have a little security, but still have the view and have a little more privacy. Anyway.
So is it reasonable to say that we could treat these as a not to exceed 6
Yeah, I
feet?
would say so.
You know, dealer's choice, so to speak, for the builder?
This is what the builders build because some people like the view or just be able to step over. That's another thing at our other house, people step over.
Particularly
There's a
with parks, I
golf
could,
ball.
Parks,
with
golf
parks, I could see that for
courses.
kids, so they don't have to go
Right.
all the way around, they can just get
Exactly.
in.
Anyway.
Yeah.
And on the right side, you can see how some people's response to the lower fence is the row of arborvitae behind it.
But this was a design choice, not because of any code.
Not that I'm aware of, no. It might have been in the original subdivision approval that they proposed it, and then all the successive phases kind of had to comply with that because it was contemplated at the time of the subdivision, but I'm not aware that we mandated this. Sort of the opposite of that is this is in Ivy Ridge Estates, which is on the south side of town. And this is not a park now, but it's a future park. And this is an example of where basically standard 6-foot fences were put along the backyards. And this is maybe not the greatest photo because the park actually isn't there yet. And so it does look a little barren. You know, I think those fences would probably look a little softer if they had landscaping and trees and such in front of them. But this is just another example of what could be allowed depending on what the code says.
Is there something to consider about what kind of materials should be allowed for whatever level of fencing around a park area? Just because if you have just a wooden fence, there's going to be that neighbor who just let it falls into disrepair, and then it's just kind of looking lousy, potentially a little bit dangerous, and then also just open. So what was kind of nice about Northwoods is it's a brick perimeter, which costs more, but is more solid, where, some of these other fences might not hold up the same way or be maintained the same way. So maybe it's just a maintenance clause of some sort for the developments to consider.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a lot to consider. There's the aesthetics, there's the safety issue, and then, yeah, like you said, there's the cost too. Especially now with we're trying to make housing easier. Do we want to make anything more expensive for housing? I think that's something we'll have to consider. Some of the older parks around town mostly have 6-foot fences around them. Legacy Park and Maple Street Park both kind of have like a variety of fences. It kind of depends on whoever's house is backing up against it. So they kind of vary from house to house, but they mostly are 6-foot. You can see on the right at Maple Street, there's some chain link, and then along Legacy Park, it's mostly wood fences. And then kind of moving on to major streets. I know this is something we've talked about before. Just like parks, most of the existing fences that butt up against major streets are just 6-foot wood fences. This is an example of sort of like the gold standard if you were trying to do something enhanced. This is one of the Tofty Farms subdivisions that's up against 13th Avenue. You can see they did, the trees every so many feet. Obviously, there's a lot of cost to this. There's more maintenance. Some subdivisions, if you don't have an HOA, that area up there can become a no man's land that no one's maintaining. So there's obviously pluses and minuses to this, but it can look great, obviously, when done nicely.
Well, I think the brick looks great, but in addition to thinking of the worst case possible that could happen is you're on the street, so God forbid a car goes up on the curb and into your fence. I'd rather have a brick wall between me and the car than a wooden fence. So I it is more costly, and I hear that and see that, but there's something to be said for the safety factor of, hey, you're on a main road, things can happen, and I like, in theory, the added stopping power of a brick wall versus a 6-foot wooden fence.
Yeah, it's good for homeowners, not so good for the pedestrians.
Yeah.
but Definitely protect the homeowners more.
Yeah.
So would you say that logic would mostly apply to like arterials and collectors and then not apply to maybe lower speed, smaller roadways, or?
That would be a tough line to draw, because I
Yeah.
know there's a lot of 25 mile per hour zones that people fly 30 plus,
That's true.
40 in all the time. So in theory, the lower speeds could if you were to implement that, let's say the lower speeds could get away with it, but people still speed like crazy. But I think for like those bigger main roads, it's like a no-brainer for safety, if nothing else, and it just looks nicer.
And maybe it ties in some way with how far the structure is from the road. If it's got a bigger setback for whatever reason, then maybe it's not something that would be necessary. But if you're going to have less than 10 feet between the back of your house and a fairly significant road, be it arterial, a collector, or whatnot, it might be worth considering something more durable than wood.
Okay. This is another example. This is Dodds Farm subdivision on the north side of town, kind of heading towards the Canby Ferry. So this is kind of like a hybrid of the ones we just looked at. You can see they did the stone pillars every so many feet, but they have the kind of standard wood fences in between. So that's another way of doing it.
There's also a significantly larger distance between the white line of the street and the fence there than a lot of the other images that we've looked at in the older neighborhoods.
And then I kind of created this slide just to show kind of what happens when you do have a lower fence. These are a couple examples, and the one on the bottom left, I think maybe is what the condition that Commissioner Hutchinson was talking about, where Northwoods borders territorial. You can see the people planted arborvitae behind it that kind of ends up functioning like a taller fence, even though the brick is lower. And then the other example is on the close, kind of over by the police station. This is on Cedar Street. You can see, I actually don't know why this one has a lower fence, because it seems to be uncommon from stuff of this age in Canby, but for whatever reason, they had a low fence. These units, this is the back of those units, so they front the other direction, but you can see homeowners have added like the rolling bamboo behind the fence to give it more height. So kind of just to summarize, the common issues for all these conditions is, privacy of your yard versus having an inviting pedestrian environment. And I don't think those two things always conflict, but sometimes they do. The character of what the Planning Commission and City Council wants the character of our public spaces to be. And then just from the code, ultimately the code, we're wanting it to be more clear. And so the struggle with some of these conversations is we start thinking of so many different scenarios, but the code has to apply to everything that walks in the door. And so that will be staff's, that will be our task to kind of take a lot of the conversations that we've talked about here and try to shoehorn that into some code. And, no code is ever perfect, but I think if we get more detailed, I think we can get closer to what we're going for. And then The other thing about the code is, like I said at the beginning, for a lot of these conditions, the code is just completely silent. There's just no text. And so in addition to revising what we have, it's always been staff's position that we'll be bulking up the code to address some of these conditions, especially the ones that touch the public realm. So a lot of these still are dealing with residential fences, and so I wanted to highlight the very few little pieces of our code that address non-residential fences. So the fence standards, where we've been pulling a lot of this code language from, has this one provision for basically all the zones for non-residential development outside of C1, because C1 is the downtown area and it shares the fence code provisions with residential, but C2, CM, M1, and M2, those are basically our light industrial and commercial districts, or planned unit development zones. And in those areas, fences are allowed to be up to 8 feet height in our current code. And if you drive around the industrial park, you can see sometimes they're 8 feet, but sometimes they're also 6 feet. Sometimes they're shorter in practice. Probably the biggest exception that I've seen since I've been here is Canby Utility had to get a variance to have a taller fence. So they have a 10-foot tall fence around their compound just because there's sensitive public utility related stuff that's in their yard. But otherwise, right now, it's 8 feet. And then the other piece is in our industrial park overlay, which is separate from our industrial underlying zones. This is the overlay that is on the Pioneer Canby Industrial Park. And there's a requirement that fences obscure laydown yards. And you've seen that in all the industrial projects that have come through Planning Commission, is they always are required to fence that in, and usually they have layered landscaping too. So I just wanted to highlight that even though there's not a lot of text for non-residential stuff, there are these couple provisions in there. So we can definitely still keep talking, but I wanted to highlight the next steps. It was sort of my plan that this would be the last time we would go over like pictures and stuff and have a more free-flowing conversation, and that next time I would bring code. I think we have talked about it a lot, and I think staff have assembled enough feedback that we can start writing the actual code. And then the idea would be to bring it back to you guys, and then obviously on to City Council for adoption. And then I also wanted to hit, this is my last slide. We also had this third bucket, which is a little separate from updating the code, but in some ways we've actually resolved some of these bullets since I came to you with this separation of buckets. And so Dawn and I have been working very closely with our new code enforcement officer. We haven't had a full-time code enforcement officer for a long time. And so she is starting to do more proactive enforcement. And so that was one of the things we had talked about, was the whole proactive versus reactive enforcement. Most issues still do come in as complaints from neighbors usually. But Chris Ann is starting to go out, and if something is egregious, she's initiating that process. And that extends to vegetation overgrowth too. And that's, I know, something Commissioner Hutchinson had brought up before is, if you have a huge hedge, isn't that creating some of the same safety issues or site distance issues that a fence would have? And she's definitely in agreement with that. So I actually was talking to Chris Ann this morning, and she was saying a lot of the recent cases that she's been dealing with were vegetation overgrowth. So that's something that she's tracking. The fence permit versus no permit, that's definitely something we could talk about. I think, and Dawn can correct me if I'm wrong, it's been staff's position that we probably don't have the bandwidth to do a fence permit. Right now, our department definitely has enough things that we're working on. I think it would be a pretty significant undertaking to be doing permits for every single fence. I think fences are always going to be discussed at the subdivision level for new subdivisions, but on a house-by-house basis, I don't think we were really contemplating going to a fence permit, but Don can correct me if I'm wrong. And we're obviously free to talk about it.
Yeah, I think everything Ryan said, I agree with. I think it's very unusual. I don't know of any jurisdiction in the metro area that has a fence permit. I mean, it's very unusual that would be the case. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't consider that here, but I think having a more reasonable code would solve most of the issues. And Ryan's done a great job with this. I think just philosophically, this community has changed over time so significantly. You just look to the north here and the old part of, the older part of downtown, near downtown area. People have larger lots. They want to show their lots off. They're not fencing in their lots. They're not on arterials. Then you go down to like Redwood, or Sequoia, and you're in a different environment. You're on an arterial. You're on a much smaller lot. So I just think those kinds of things are in perspective here as we continue to grow, the city grows, having some reasonableness in where fences can and cannot go. And I think there are some geographies that make a difference in that as well, what makes sense in one part of the city may not make sense in others. But again, back to the uniformity of the code, I think that is important. But I do think lots they're definitely notching down to be smaller and smaller because of the home prices. And so that I think has a big influence on this process as well.
I have a concern with as the lots are getting smaller and smaller, and people do want to fence off, particularly their backyards where they can, having something that does address the proximity to a road and sidewalks, specifically. Because if everybody has a 6-foot fence and every 20 feet somebody has a car that they're going to have to back out of their single car driveway, then we're just asking for so much trouble with people who have zero visibility until the butt end of their car is already in the street past the sidewalk. And we have a school district where you have to walk to school, the high school, if you live within 2 miles, and you have to walk to elementary or middle school if you live within 1 mile, which means almost every single kid in this district is on foot or on a bike. And so I'm just really concerned about fences adjacent to pedestrian vehicle pathways.
And just to echo, site visibility is really critical. Fortunately, and I think those are more historic developments, we do not allow people on our arterial. You cannot have a driveway on an arterial anywhere in the city. That's a brand new development. So you're only seeing that in older parts of the city. Super dangerous. We've had people that have wanted to have, like a connection on Ivy. You already have a connection from the back of your property, or the front of your property, which is behind it. And it's like, no, you cannot have another connection to your garage or whatever you're building there. It's just super dangerous. So that, I think, solves a lot of that. But to your point, I think the visibility piece is really critical we want it to be safe as well. I think it's a challenging balance, to be honest with you. I think it's great if people want to show off more of the front of their yards, but I think that's probably not going to always be the case. I'm hoping that more thematically is the case, but side and rear yards are, in my opinion, especially if they face an arterial, you got children, you got dogs, people that have those kinds of things. A lot of people do, and have children and dogs and et cetera, and it's just a safety issue. And I think that it kind of makes sense. Every community deals with this differently, and that's the other part of it, is fencing, as you see it different in every community. And I think that part of what we're trying to get to, I think, is understanding, kind of what the end product is. And it's a little challenging in some ways, because when we're going through a land use review, we're not dealing with the contractor. Mm-hmm. We're dealing with the engineers and the designers of the project. And so what it ends up looking like in the end is something that we still review, and we're seeing what that is. But it's I mean, it might be that we may not be successful in getting to that point, but we could ask for that information about, fencing, those kinds of things. It's not something in our code that necessarily is a driver for a subdivision, but it's not an unfair question to ask. They may not have an answer for that, but I think many times what we're struggling a bit with is where's the driveway going to go, and, what's the orientation of the house, or even a footprint of the house. We really can't technically ask for that level of detail other than but that's helpful. But I think ultimately, as we get more dense, those kind of questions are going to become more and more important as to pre-planning. What is the envelope? Where's the home going to go? And we're not in disfavor of smaller lots, but sometimes that's really challenging for us, to be quite frank as well. You got three yards. I mean, which one of them is your side? How many sides and how many fronts do you have? And our own code becomes quite challenging on that as well.
Corner lots, I think, are going to be harder.
Yeah, exactly.
But, and along those lines, it's like in those properties that are along territorial where the back of the house is right up against another street. It's the backside of all those lots, and so there aren't any driveways there. And so it seems to me I think most people have a reasonable expectation of being able to have some privacy in their backyard, just without people gawking in there, at least without you being able to shout at your neighbor and tell them to knock it off. And so, I'm trying to think of a place where you would not want to have a 6-foot fence covering someone's backyard if there was a street there. And I think that really a lot of that comes out to the buffer, where if it was just street, curb, sidewalk, fence, and the only safe zone that you had as a pedestrian was 4 feet, that seems a little tight to me. But I mean, I don't see any reason why people shouldn't be able to have a section of their yard fenced off away from public view so their teenage daughter can sunbathe back there without everyone staring.
Well, what I'm kind of thinking is we have a lot of instances where it's not just new construction, right? Where it's existing homes that are building new fences right out to the property line. And sometimes these are neighborhoods that don't even have sidewalks, which means it's road fence. Mm-hmm. And so what I would, in my ideal world, for us to have some kind of language baked into the code that we can start getting the word out that if it is anywhere near a driveway, that it needs to kind of come down to a certain amount so that it's not a 6-foot fence all the way up to the sidewalk where there's driveways and people coming in and out. Mm-hmm. And then for where it's a backyard, that there's some kind of expectation that you don't build it up to the actual pavement on something that doesn't have a sidewalk, because that isn't really their yard anyways. They just go as far out as they can. And that ends up being more of an enforcement thing than a construction thing. But if we at least have some kind of guidance or language that could allow for enforcement, or people kind of getting, having something to kind of get out to the community, like, hey, it's not cool to build a fence.
How would
right
alleyways factor into that? Because none of those.
Alleyways are quite a question, right? I don't have the
I
answer
was
to the
gonna say,
alleyways.
I got a situation that it's honestly, I'm just looking for creative solutions, because so I live on the corner of 4th and Cedar. I'm on an alleyway. I've got the neighbor right behind me. They've got their 6-foot fence right up to the curb line. So there's no sidewalk over there. People always walk over there anyways, because the neighbors across the street got really scary dogs. So people are always walking where there's no sidewalk anyways. Well, I can see through their fence slats. I have a 3-foot fence, and I don't even have, close to the alleyway fenced even, for visibility issues. What I can't see past are all the cars that park right up along that side. So I'm thinking, at that point, the fence isn't even an issue. It's all the cars that park there. Even the cars that are parked along my 3-foot fence that I can see over, I can't see. And there's, 10 foot of yellow curb on the front of the intersection, but then they park all along my fence line and I can't see around them. And I pull out of that driveway every single day and I can't see either way, because there's cars that park along the fence that's right up to the curb, and then there's cars that park along the other side. And I'm like, okay, there's no sidewalks, there's no visibility, and that's with the 3-foot fence. So I'm trying to figure out, I don't want to take away their parking, but do we yellow curb the whole entire thing so we can safely pull out? What would you do in that situation? Because at that point, the fence isn't even causing the issue. Even though they have a 6-foot fence, I can see through it. It's the cars that park next to it. So then it's like, okay, talking about the proactive versus reactive enforcement. Okay, you can't, they're grandfathered in, so to speak, with that fence, and that's not truly the issue. So do we leave the fence and just ask to have the city yellow curb it so we have visibility? Because I don't know what to do in that situation. And it's an everyday thing.
Yep, in the older neighborhoods, it's all that way. I mean,
Yeah.
my neighborhood's the same way. If I didn't have a car that had all kinds of sensors that could like, as I'm just eking out, it could like tell me if there is a car or pedestrian,
Yeah.
then it's
the
just
city
that much
can
more
put a mirror out
nerve-wracking.
for you.
Wouldn't that be nice? That'd be so nice.
What was that?
A mirror, put a
They've
mirror
got
up.
those convex mirrors.
Yeah, those
Yeah.
big round
Some-
ones.
Yeah.
Like
But
when
do
you
the
live out in the
neighbors want
country.
that on the back of their, their.
You can put them at the end of your driveway, kind of like if you lived out in the country, and that kind
Yeah.
of gives you.
You know, and
Greater
I
view.
totally understand. I think part of this is you have older street systems and they probably don't follow the exact,
No.
sight distance spacing either. And I have a situation where I drive home at night, it's similar, where I'm
Yeah.
like turning left.
Yeah.
Like, am I going to make it? You know,
Yeah.
and it's actually not on a high-speed road. And
Yeah.
I mean, because there's cars along the
Oh,
road
yeah.
and you have to get out quite a ways to be able to get into the lane.
That's me in my truck.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah, it's
I
like-
get honked at all
yeah.
the time. I'm like, I can't see. What
At
do
least you
want
got a
me to
truck,
do?
you've got better visibility. Anybody in a car
That's
is
what I'm
completely
saying.
up a creek.
My wife's vehicle's little, and when she pulls out, I'm like, oh my God, please don't die. Like, it's like, because people, it's 25
Yeah.
on Cedar, but people come ripping all, down towards the post office, whatever. And that's again, that 25 mile per hour zone doesn't really mean anything. But who am I to tell my neighbor, hey, the fence you've had for, over 20 years, you need to take it down? It's not even that, it's the cars that are next to them. And it's, how do you deal with that sort of situation? Because I'm sitting here like, okay, I use it every single day. And that's a safety thing. And I'm following the fence rules, and I still can't see around them. So I don't know how to fix that
And
situation.
that's an alley situation?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because it's, I got my
discuss that on
street
alley.
parking on the
Please.
front and then all
we
the way to
schedule
the
alley
alley.
day?
Yeah. But I was just thinking in terms of like proactive, reactive, like
Yeah.
if someone has a fence that's 6 feet tall, that is right up to the corner of the curb and you can't see around it, who wants to go and ask them to shorten it? So then how do you fix that? Because it is still a visibility issue along those lines. That just happens to be the one I deal with every day. But there's lots out there, especially the alleyways. Commissioner Ellison would understand that, Chair Ellison. Because you built your
Let's
fence
get it on the calendar,
15
Potter.
feet back.
Alleyways. Talk about it.
I have
Let's talk about it.
around this round, thinking about some of the stuff we talked about with alleys. I don't know.
fun.
I think he's just selling his lots.
Mine's still unpaved, the alleyway behind our house. We're the only one in the lot that's unpaved, actually. I was like, oh, dang it, we missed the boat on that one. But
I know the council, and this has not been, it's been ping-ponged a bit. I'm going slightly off topic here.
Sorry.
But I know that the part of the, the alleyway thing was like the pavement, how wide should they be? And then I know there's been site visibility discussions in many of our hearings. Ryan, any thoughts on, we don't want to we're trying to deal with the fence issue alone.
Sure.
But I mean, but it is a relevant issue to that.
Well,
Yeah.
and on that particular alleyway, all those residents are screwed no matter which end of the alleyway they go out.
Yeah.
Because on the opposite end of that alleyway is 6-foot fence on one side, these 5 massive
Massive.
arborvitaes that are like 20 feet tall. You literally have to get out into the street or you cannot see who's coming from Eccles.
Yeah.
And you could get taken out so quick.
Because that was our solution, is we'll just go the other way, even if it's longer for safety, but then you got the kiddos all running on that side, and you still can't see, and there's still cars parked along, it's like, oh.
And then we
man.
just approved putting in a whole bunch of apartments there that are going to open up onto the driveway.
Yeah, a
alleys,
few
so.
blocks down,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well,
Something to be considered.
one of the things that we talked about in one of our previous sessions was, when we were talking about alleys, was Commissioner Ewert had talked about us having vision clearance triangles at alleys in addition to streets. And so I think that was something that, I don't know if this is how much it's going to impact this particular situation, but that was something that we were going to try to carry forward.
And that's kind of where the intersection of this fence conversation ties in, because corner lots with fencing, I had to go through when I was building my fence on the corner lot. We had, the visibility triangle was a factor. The setback from what's our side street, Douglas?
Douglas, yeah.
Yeah, the setback from Douglas was a factor, also because of visibility.
Suddenly 15 feet of your yard was gone.
Yeah. Yeah, it had to be
For visibility.
15 feet back from back a curb, actually.
Yeah.
So, but it's weird that it got a block away, that got enforced, but a block away from me, it's like, to Ryan's point, it's a little bit of everything. Just in 2 blocks from,
Well, maybe in some of these like high concern areas around elementary schools, like dense areas, in the alleyways, specifically with the 6-foot fences, so you cannot see anything when you're trying to pull out around the cars that are parked on either side of the actual streets. Maybe we even see if the city can use any of their grant funding from anything to just pay to fix some corners of people's fences, so that like, that we like rebuild the corners of a couple fences just to bring them down to a level that's actually safe.
Do we ever look at accident history to see if there are any problem areas?
That's a good question.
The reason I ask is out where I am, there's a really dangerous corner. Seems like Life Flight is out there every, 6 months. And ODOT is actually reimbursing a farmer for part of his orchard to remove it.
Oh, wow.
Because the corner is so bad. But it's based on accident history because the orchard's been there a long time.
ODOT won't get involved until enough people die, so they must have been really nasty accidents, like
They-
really, with
yeah,
life
they are.
coming out and whatnot, because just accidents isn't enough to move ODOT to allow you to make changes.
Yeah. Anyway, that's, if, I don't know how available that might be to look at a specific area in town and say, well, that problem needs to be addressed, if,
Police does provide a kind of running list of the intersections or general areas that are affected by accidents and tickets each month. I had suggested to the Traffic Safety Committee to have them just kind of like geolocate everything so you could see it on a map and kind of like see kind of like a heat map of that. It's not done at this point, but I will bring it up with them again because that would be a resource that we could potentially use to
might
kind
help
of
to
see.
prioritize some things, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah. Unrelated to all of this, I had a question for Michael on the Springwater Trail. So there are a lot of people who end up camping through that corridor. Based on your experiences with that, do you have any thoughts about a higher or lower fence being better or worse?
It doesn't matter. It's once there's people camping there.
Yeah, you almost want to have the higher fence because then you don't see as much
Yeah,
of it.
then you want one 20 feet tall, and
Yeah.
they'll just set it on fire at the bottom. So,
Sure.
yeah, it's the fires have really become a problem. It's like there's a couple of maintenance facilities that abut the Springwater corridor, and they've had to cut their landscaping up and back. I replace their fire extinguishers frequently.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's really kind of the issue with that. And it's like once somebody calls it home, then you're dealing with everything that a home can provide, and insecticides and burning plastic and all else.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's, that's the one thing that I'm kind of concerned about with the emerald necklace is it's like, as long as we keep it patrolled, it's going to be the most wonderful thing in the world. But it's like, if we ever get to a point where it's old news and we don't care about it so much more, and there's another part of town that's fancier where everyone likes to go or whatever, and then, I mean, that's kind of, all up to civic character. So
Yep.
I have high hopes. And actually, Springwater's clean. I mean, Portland's slowly getting it together
Yeah,
too.
I know they're
But
improving it.
it's taken a while. I mean, the streak of opportunism in humanity is broad and runs deep, and you have to make your decisions and stick by them, and hopefully not be inhumane in the process. That's hard.
I have one more question for tonight's topic, if I could. So back to the brief discussion about gated communities. I'm not saying we need to put that in the code, but what would happen if a developer came to us with a proposed gated community? If there's nothing in the code about it, how do we process that?
We really wouldn't have any regulatory ability to do that other than, obviously it would be a fire issue because fire would be concerned with getting in there. I think they'd have to follow the same standards, how, would it be, metal gate that opened, what would that look like? I'm personally not a proponent of gated communities, and I've seen them in substantial numbers in other communities. And again, that's just my personal thought on the matter. It creates other challenges with things as well. Public streets, would they be private streets? Would they be public streets? It creates a whole series of questions in my mind when you gate something off.
And probably resources, if somebody's there that shouldn't be and having to use the local police force about it. I don't know, but it's just a thought.
And
Wondering if someone might come with that someday, that's
Yeah.
all.
Yeah,
I'm
they
not
could,
saying
yeah.
I'm for them, or I live in one
Yeah.
down south, but most of the ones I see, they build them, but then they leave them open all the time.
Yeah.
But not where we are, it's
Yeah.
very strict, but
our code does prioritize connection points, and so I think that's one of the reasons why maybe we haven't seen any gated communities is, because the goal is always more connectivity, and that's why you see Tofty or I'm trying to think, or Northwoods or Dodds, or these subdivisions tend to have 3 or 4 different ways that you can get out, and gated communities tend to be the opposite. They kind of funnel everyone down to one entry point, so something to consider.
okay.
Any more questions on the fencing?
If you wouldn't mind, Charleston, going back to the one that I had the most photos of, so paths, I kind of want to get a sense of the commission's direction they are thinking we should take with these types of conditions. Are we liking what has gone on in the past, where it's kind of more privacy along your backyard, but once you get to the front setback, then it steps down? Is that
Yeah.
something we want to memorialize?
Yes.
I think so. I think people should be able to have their private backyard, and I think having the short fence, still denotes, hey, this is my property, don't go throwing your trash on it or anything, but also gives the necessary visibility for cars and pedestrians and.
We might need to address, in the rare situations, that the part of the yard that abuts the sidewalk and the road is not a front yard, just laying out maybe criteria of where that is and isn't acceptable to have a 6-foot fence. Like, if there's a driveway that can go onto the road,
This is a path,
like a side, well, yeah.
Only
but-
for paths, yeah.
no driveway to the road, this is.
Well, there is right next to it.
Yeah, but that's not.
on
a
either
path.
side of it.
We're just talking about paths.
But if the paths are right next to residential housing and sidewalks and roads, then regardless of what side of the house is, because it could be the side of the house, it doesn't have to be the back of the house of the.
If the path wasn't there, the fencing would be the same, wouldn't it?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, so that last session where we went over the typical houses, my take on that was we kind of landed on the same thing, where if you're on a corner lot, you could box in your backyard, but then once you got to the front setback, then it had to step down. So hypothetically, if you had 4 houses in a row on the block and then a path down the middle, you're kind of going to be seeing the same, whether it's adjacent to the path or just 2 houses next to each other, they would both step down in both conditions.
Is the front of the house is defined where the driveway is?
Generally, yeah.
Okay. So we can just say the front of the house, fencing shall step down without having to have special language because of the driveway.
Because we've seen some proposals, especially with the consultants who have come in to show us some of the cottage clusters and whatnot, and they definitely had driveways that were not going to the front of the house, they were going to the side of the house, the back of the house, different places. So that's where I was kind of saying we might want to consider where the driveway is or what the front is with relationship to the road and paths.
So would path/alleyway be viewed the same way, or would we just hold that off for a whole nother discussion, which I'm fine with either way? I just am curious because the alleyways will have
the same thing.
they're going to have kind of the same problem.
Yeah, but there's more issues of sovereignty involved. So the backyard,
Yeah.
I think alleyways need to be
An entire different.
considered in their own
Got it.
subject. Just, I don't see any other way we're
Because
going
I've
to get
seen,
anywhere.
I've seen the driveways on both,
Yeah.
front and back, and with an alleyway. So it's harder to kind of pin that one down, but
I
anyway.
mean, I personally think that the council needs to do some things about alleyways. Like, the convex mirrors thing is something that's common to county roads, and most of the larger municipalities will do it. And one of the problems that we have is that our light poles are private property of our cooperative utility, and so we can't just bolt them up on there. And so, I think that the things that other communities can simply just do, we kind of have to come up with a methodology in the law to do it.
I think another aspect is because we are in the midst of doing our comp plan update, which includes the TSP update and the technical reports that support it do address our street sections, both looking at our cross sections of our current street classifications and proposing new ones where appropriate. And so I think Dawn and I can take that message to our transportation team to make sure that alley cross sections are one of the ones that they should be looking at in addition to other types of streets.
Great.
And I think, I do think it's a separate topic, but and I don't want to get into the weeds tonight at all on this, but I do think that, what you're talking about, Chair Olson, about site visibility, at a very minimum, you shouldn't have a situation where you can't see around a corner. So whether that means you square, you angle it off or whatever that is, even if it's not set down, that just seems like a problem right there, just so. Yeah.
I have heard the city council mention paving standards.
I
It's been a
heard
while,
it.
but I've heard them talk about it.
I heard it get mentioned, have yet to have a paved alleyway.
Well, fairly recently, didn't they just approve something to say that the alleyways should be regarded as streets, just for terms of development? Didn't they decide that recently? Because there's funding for the downtown
If they did, I didn't
area
catch it.
where they were kind of pushing for,
Yeah, I think it might have been the Urban Renewal District is doing an alley paving project.
Yeah, and I've lost track of where that's at, and it felt like that was really on, and then it kind of faded into the background, and I don't know if that was because the funding source was not there, or I don't know all the details, but at one point, everybody was talking about alleys, and then not everybody was talking about alleys.
Don't quote me on this, but I believe there was a subset of the alleys downtown that were funded for improvements.
And I think some of this went into the ARPA funding, which got, anyway, I don't want to speculate, but there were some weird things that were like being sorted as to what that was going to be.
I'll just keep crossing my fingers.
Okay.
Well, we
if
can
you happen
report
to hear
back.
anything one way or another, let us know.
This was excellent, by the way. Thank you for all
Yeah.
the time you put into it and
The
the
visuals
photos.
were
It's
great.
just amazing work. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Okay, so just in brief summary, so the next phase of this is going to have some language recommendations from planning staff for us to needle at and tweak, change, or just,
Exactly,
okay.
correct.
Good. All right, so any items of interest? Do we want to close out on this subject
Yes,
matter and
let's
head
close
over to
out,
items
yeah.
of interest? Okay. Do you want to talk about future meetings,
Yeah,
Dawn?
absolutely. Chair Ellison, I'm just going to give a few updates. We do not have any hearing items for September or work session items for September 9th or September 23rd. So Planning Commission we're not going to have any meetings in September. However, we are gearing up for a number of hearings in October. I'm sorry, in September, we will not have any Planning Commission hearings in September, but in October, we'll have October 14th, which is our housing efficiency measures, cottage cluster and planning unit development updates. That'll be a hearing on October 14th. Then also on October 28th, we'll have housing production strategies, which will be another Planning Commission hearing. The housing needs analysis, just as an update, you all reviewed that, the council approved that, and that is now effective, was approved on August 7th. And so that's a background, that background information will be discussed in context of those two housing efficiency measures and housing production strategies. Tomorrow evening, and this is just a FYI for everyone, there is a Spanish language summit for the comprehensive plan tomorrow at Baker Prairie School at 6 p.m. If you're interested, and we do have a limited number of headsets for English speakers that are not Spanish speakers, like myself. But we have several folks which is great, from the city, who will be, they're bilingual, that'll be helping with that. And we also have a consultant running through the presentation. We're pretty excited about working with Bridging Cultures. And they're bringing folks to the summit, obviously, and we'll see this as a positive thing to get input, and with the focus on the comprehensive plan and housing and where we're at in the process to date.
That's at 6 o'clock?
6 o'clock, 6 p.m. Baker Prairie. And so we have got that coming up. And then on September 18th, we have a council work session on the transportation system plan, September 18th, just to give council an update of that. The next comprehensive plan community summit probably will be in early 2025 is where we're at right at this point. We're doing a lot of coordination with Department of Land Conservation and Development right at this point on if there are adjustments made in the comprehensive plan process that we're doing now that change comprehensive plan designations. What does that mean specifically to ultimately our housing needs that were identified in our housing needs analysis? It has to do with the mix of housing. The state laws really more like guidelines, and so we're working through that with DLCD on that. And the council's been involved with that process, but we're working through some of those issues with DLCD right at this moment. We may end up not making any changes to the comprehensive plan in terms of actually changing designations. This is for land within the city and within the current urban growth boundary. Or we may decide to do that, and what are the resultant housing mix items that would come out of that as part of the question we're trying to get to. Ultimately, we need to know this anyway because of the urban growth boundary process requires us to have all that sorted out before we initiate that. Those are pretty much the main updates. If you all have any questions, I'm glad to answer.
So again, no meeting for the month of September.
No meetings for
Pick back up
September.
in October.
Yeah, back in October. And then we have some hearings and pipeline. I think it's going to be, you're going to start to see more hearings towards the end of the year. It's not like there's no applications, but they have not reached the point where they're ready for hearing. So.
Okay.
So we'll start to see that pick back up. And then next year, there'll be a number of other things happening with the comprehensive plan, which as that updates, with the hope that we'll be through, I'm hoping this time next year, we'll be through the city and city limits and current urban growth boundary comprehensive plan adoption, and we will have initiated the urban growth boundary expansion at that point. That's the hope. It's not easy going through this process, and it's not like there's a series of breadcrumbs that are completely laid out and tells you exactly what to do. So it's we're sorting it out as we go, but so far so good.
Great.
Could we have a quick TSP update where it is in its process?
Say.
Could we have a quick TSP update where it is in its process?
Yeah, it's parallel with the comprehensive plan update process and going through and looking at volumes and forecasts within the city. Levels of service will start to be looked at, and that'll be a discussion really as a policy level item. I think that we're not completely there with all the housing and employment numbers throughout the city, and some of that goes back to this item of like let's say hypothetically, there was a change in the comprehensive plan that recognized Jarbo's Restaurant, that actually should not be residentially pre-designated, but commercial. What does that mean for the transportation system plan?
Gotcha.
So there's employment, that would be different under a residential pre-designation than a commercial pre-designation. But all this right now, there's number crunching that our consultants are doing on housing and employment numbers that basically have to go through and look at those things. Ryan mentioned cross-sections on alleys, great idea. And there'll be cross-sections on other standard roads as well, complete streets, which is my vision, which is our vision, that we'll have complete streets, meaning that you'll have sidewalks, you'll have, bike lanes, you'll have, hopefully avoiding those pinch points that exist for streets that, are offset or smaller that are currently in the city. It doesn't really solve that issue there, but for future streets, that they have all the amenities with them. And, that's the goal anyway. And I think that's part of the discussion as well, as what are we seeing now in the volumes? What are we seeing in the future in volumes? And what does that look like? And that's part of that discussion.
And what are those safe routes to school? Make sure we're paying attention to those when they're assessing.
Yeah, and that's important as well. I mean, those are all feeding into the, discussion. And obviously, there's some work to be probably done throughout the city as well on, pedestrian mobility. I mean, I think the city does a really good job of trying to, address those issues, but we can always improve. Yeah.
Thank you.
And I'll just add that our consultant team periodically adds files and plans and technical reports and other materials to the Cultivating Canby website, and which is up, but I can send this group a link to that just so it's fresh in your inbox, because it's a good place to check back, and any materials that are coming out with the comp plan and TSP, those are uploaded to that website.
Thank you.
And that was all we had. Yep.
Okay, anything else from this body before we take a motion to adjourn? All right, do we have a motion to adjourn?
Move to adjourn this meeting.
Do we have a second?
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All right, thank you, Cam.